Well, thank you very much for inviting me to give a talk in this colloquium series. That is a great honor. So I work on ancient Greek philosophy, and I specifically focus on logic, the philosophy of language, and epistemology. And today I want to present a paper entitled, "Is Protagoras a Relativist About Truth?" Now, who is this? I'm just going to try to move on to the next slide. Yes, here we are. So who is this Protagoras mentioned in my title? Well, Protagoras is an ancient Greek philosopher from the 5th century BC. He lived a bit earlier than Plato and Aristotle, and he was born in Abdera in northern Greece. Now, none of Protagoras' works have been fully transmitted to us, but we mainly know about his ideas through discussions of them in later philosophers, in particular in Plato and Aristotle. But we do have some fragments from Protagoras' works which are quoted by later philosophers. And the most famous fragment, which you may have heard of, is known as the measure doctrine. So according to the measure doctrine, man is the measure of all things, of the things which are, that they are, and of the things which are not, that they are not. And the key idea of this measure doctrine seems to be that the standard or measure of what is real or what is true is ultimately a human standard. So it is tied to the human perspective. And it seems that Protagoras used this measure doctrine as a slogan for his general views about truth. And we know that Protagoras was very interested in truth. So he wrote a book with the telling title Truth. And we also have extensive discussions of his views about truth in Plato and Aristotle. So in particular, Plato and Aristotle ascribe a very radical view to Protagoras, namely the view that there are no false beliefs and that all beliefs are equal with respect to truth. Now, before I go any deeper into Protagoras' views about truth, it may be good to pause for a while and ask why we should care about this. Because as I said, Protagoras lived almost 2,500 years ago. So why is this relevant to us today? Well, my first answer would be that truth matters, and that truth is a very important philosophical theme in 2021. Indeed, it's more important than ever, I would say. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we are currently living through a truth crisis in which public and political discourse is increasingly detached from the truth and the facts. And an underlying cause of this is that people increasingly live in their own information bubbles where they only get to see views and information that is in agreement with their pre-existing beliefs. So this truth crisis raises a number of important philosophical questions surrounding the notion of truth. But I think that the key question is really whether truth is still a value, and if so, how we can rehabilitate truth as a value. And one important sub-question here, which relates to some of the research interests of your center, I think, is what the role of scientists and experts is in this. So for example, how can scientists and experts enable or help politicians or governments pursue fact-based policies? And how can they communicate about the results of scientific research to the general audience? So those are just some questions about truth that I think are still very important today. And another reason why I think we should care about Protagoras is that Protagoras matters. So Protagoras has had a substantial influence on the history of philosophy. And he had that influence mainly as one of the chief intellectual opponents of Plato and Aristotle. So to put it somewhat anachronistically, one might say that Protagoras is a pragmatist who tries to debunk the significance of notions such as truth and reality, whereas Plato and Aristotle try to vindicate a more substantial role for these notions. And in this audience where I think we have quite a few logicians, One particularly interesting example to mention might be Aristotle's discussion of the fundamental principles of logic, such as the principle of non-contradiction. So when Aristotle formulates these principles for the first time in Western philosophy, he contrasts them with the views of earlier thinkers, and in particular with Protagoras' views. And Aristotle claims that these earlier thinkers violate, in what they say, violate the fundamental principles of logic. So it seems that these earlier thinkers, and Protagoras in particular, stimulated Aristotle to formulate the principles of logic and to think about logic more generally, precisely because Aristotle thought that these thinkers violated those principles in what they were saying. Okay, so back to Protagoras on truth. Now, the most detailed discussion of Protagoras' views on truth can be found in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus. And the Theaetetus, by the way, also quotes the measure doctrine that I mentioned earlier. And from now on, I'm going to focus exclusively on Protagoras' views as discussed in the Theaetetus, the most detailed discussion of his views. So in the Theaetetus in particular, Protagoras denies that there are false beliefs, and he claims that all beliefs are equal with respect to truth. Now, many scholars have, on the basis of Plato's discussion of Protagoras' views in the Theaetetus, many scholars have ascribed to Protagoras a form of relativism about truth. And according to this form of relativism about truth, no belief is absolutely true or absolutely false, but each belief is true relative to the believer. So the truth of beliefs is relative to believers. And the question that I'm asking in this talk is, are these scholars right in ascribing to Protagoras a form of relativism about truth, this specific form of relativism about truth? So before I go into that any further, it might again be good to ask, well, why should we care about this? Why does it matter whether Protagoras is a relativist about truth? So just take a sip of water. Now, first of all, I would say that relativism about truth is a view that has fascinated many modern philosophers, in particular from the 19th century onwards. So some philosophers have arguably endorsed relativism about truth, or at least flirted with it. So Nietzsche might be one example of that. Whereas other philosophers have tried to refute relativism about truth. And a notable example is Frege, who argues that the relativist about truth cannot coherently make assertions. And recently, there has been a revival of relativism about truth in the philosophy of language. And some philosophers of language have argued for local versions of relativism about truth. So in particular, John Macfarlane has argued that in certain domains, such as judgments of taste, truth is relative to a context of assessment. And it might be interesting to mention here that John Macfarlane has recently himself done some work on Protagoras, asking the very same question that I am asking today, namely whether Protagoras is a relativist about truth. And you can find a paper on that on his website. Okay, so now if Protagoras is a relativist about truth, that would mean that this view goes all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. And indeed, it would presumably mean that Protagoras is the first relativist about truth in Western philosophy. So that would be a substantial fact in the history of philosophy. So all the more reason to care about the question. Okay, so back to Plato's Theaetetus, which, as I said, contains the most detailed discussion of Protagoras' views about truth. Now, when we try to determine whether Protagoras in Plato's Theaetetus is a relativist about truth, we run into a problem. And the problem is that Plato uses two different formulations for Protagoras' view about truth. And there are multiple occurrences of each of these two formulations. So sometimes Plato ascribes to Protagoras the view that whatever is believed is true for the believer. And I will call that formulation 1. Now, at other times, Plato ascribes to Protagoras the view that whatever is believed is true, and I will call that formulation 2. So the crucial difference between formulation 1 and formulation 2 is that only formulation 1 contains the qualification for the believer. Now, the scholars who claim that Protagoras is a relativist about truth, so I will call those scholars the relativist interpreters from now on. The relativist interpreters have often pointed to formulation 1 as alleged evidence for the claim that Protagoras is a relativist about truth. So the relativist interpreters typically take formulation 1 to be an expression of relativism about truth. They take formulation 1 to say that the truth of beliefs is relative to believers. And they specifically take the qualification for the believer to relativize truth to believers. Now, in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to argue that the relativist interpretation is mistaken and that Protagoras is not a relativist about truth. But before I'm going to set out my own interpretation, I'm going to raise two objections to the relativist interpretation. And the first objection is one that you may already have anticipated by this stage, and that concerns the second formulation, which says that whatever is believed is true. So the second formulation lacks the qualification for the believer, and because of that, it cannot easily be seen as an expression of relativism about truth. Now, but despite that, there are several occurrences, as I said, of each of the formulations, in particular the second one. Now, relativist interpreters could respond to this, and indeed some have responded to this, by saying that Plato is just being a bit sloppy when he uses the second formulation for Protagoras' view. So the idea would be that when Plato uses the second formulation, he just doesn't bother to add in the qualification for the believer. But we should understand occurrences of the second formulation as if that qualification is implicitly present, because after all, it's explicitly present in other places where Plato uses formulation 1. But I don't find this defense of the relativist interpretation particularly compelling. And the main reason for that is that if Protagoras is a relativist about truth, and if the qualification for the believer is meant to express relativism about truth, then that qualification really makes a crucial difference to Protagoras' view. So Plato would be really sloppy in leaving it out when using formulation 2. So I think it is quite an accusation at the address of Plato to say that he is just being a bit sloppy here. And an accusation that we should try to avoid if possible, I would say. Okay, now my second objection to the relativist interpretation has something to do with one of the arguments that Plato puts forward against Protagoras' view. And Plato himself calls this the cleverest argument, suggesting that Plato thinks of it as the cleverest argument against Protagoras' view. And the point of the cleverest argument is that Protagoras' view is self-defeating. And it is self-defeating in a dialectical sense. It's self-defeating in the sense that when Protagoras is confronted by his opponents, he is rationally forced to give up his own view or to deny his own view. Not just give up, actually, but deny. If we look at the text as it stands, here is how this confrontation between Protagoras and his opponents goes. So Protagoras expresses his view that all beliefs are true, and Protagoras' opponents then respond to this by confronting Protagoras with their belief that Protagoras' belief is false. Now, Protagoras then, in response to his opponents, concedes to his opponents that their belief in particular is true, because after all, Protagoras believes that all beliefs are true, so he's committed to conceding to his opponents that in particular his opponent's belief is true. But in conceding to his opponents that their belief in particular is true, Protagoras is committed to conceding to them that his belief is false. Because after all, what his opponents believe is that Protagoras' belief is false. But then in conceding to his opponents that his belief is false, Protagoras is committed to conceding to his opponents that it is not the case that all beliefs are true, because that's what it means for Protagoras' belief to be false. So in other words, Protagoras ends up denying his own initial view that all beliefs are true. Now, I submit that this is a successful argument against the view that all beliefs are true. It's successful in the sense that the argument shows that someone who holds this view is forced to give up or deny their view when confronted by their opponents. But of course, if Protagoras is a relativist about truth, then the argument as it stands misses its target. Because as a relativist about truth, Protagoras' view is not simply that all beliefs are true, but rather that all beliefs are true relative to the believer. So in order to understand this as an argument against relativism about truth, we need to supply a number of qualifications. And indeed, the relativist interpreters have argued that we should do precisely that. They point to other places in Plato's discussion of Protagoras where we do have these qualifications, and they then say that we should also add them in the cleverest argument. So let us supply these qualifications. Now, Protagoras' view is now that all beliefs are true relative to the believer. The opponents then confront Protagoras with their belief that Protagoras' belief is false, and we don't need qualifications here because the opponents are not relativists about truth. Now, Protagoras, as a relativist about truth, would presumably concede to his opponents that their belief in particular is true relative to his opponents. Because as a relativist about truth, what he would presumably say is, okay, you believe this, so this is true relative to you. Now, and presumably it would follow from that concession that Protagoras' belief is false relative to Protagoras' opponents. Because after all, what Protagoras' opponents believe is that Protagoras' belief is false. And presumably it would follow from that it is not the case relative to Protagoras' opponents that all beliefs are true relative to the believer. Now, the problem with this understanding of the argument is that it fails to show that Protagoras' view is self-defeating, because Protagoras can happily make the final concession whilst sticking to his belief that all beliefs are true relative to the believer. So Protagoras can simply concede to his opponents that his belief is false relative to his opponents, whilst insisting that his belief is true relative to himself. So he can hold on to his belief that all beliefs are true relative to the believer as something that is true relative to himself. And of course, as a relativist about truth, all there is to the truth of a belief is something that is true relative to oneself. So it seems that Protagoras can stick to his initial view. So to sum up, there are two problems with the relativist interpretation of the cleverest argument. One problem is that we need to supply qualifications that are not present in the text as it stands. And the second problem is that when these qualifications are supplied, the argument fails to show that Protagoras' view is self-defeating. Okay, now that brings me to my own interpretation of Protagoras' view, which I shall call the absolutist interpretation. So I propose that Protagoras holds that all beliefs are absolutely true. So their truth is not relative to believers. So if we think again about Plato's two formulations of Protagoras' view, I can now easily account for the second formulation, which says that whatever is believed is true, because if all beliefs are absolutely true, then it follows that whatever is believed is true without any qualification. It's true simpliciter. But what am I going to do with the first formulation, which says that whatever is believed is true for the believer? How am I going to explain for the believer in such a way that it does not amount to relativism about truth? Now, before I can set out my own interpretation of formulation 1, I need to say a bit more about the details of Protagoras' theory. And specifically, I need to talk about Protagoras' discussion of conflicting beliefs. And we get a lot of that in the Theaetetus. And so here is a variant of the cases that you find in the Theaetetus. So I call it the wine tasting. So suppose that Socrates and Theaetetus both drink a glass from the same bottle of Merlot. Socrates believes that the wine is sweet, whereas Theaetetus believes that the wine is bitter. Now, here is what Protagoras is supposed to say about this case. So first of all, Protagoras says that the wine in itself, oh yes, by the way, I should have mentioned that I take this to be conflicting beliefs. So I assume that Socrates believes that not just that the wine is sweet, but also that it's not bitter, and Theaetetus believes not just that the wine is bitter, but also that it's not sweet. So they're conflicting beliefs. Okay, so back to what Protagoras says about. So Protagoras is supposed to say about this that the wine in itself is neither sweet nor bitter. And moreover, he is supposed to say that the wine is sweet for Socrates, who believes that the wine is sweet. And he is supposed to say that the wine is bitter for Theaetetus, who believes that the wine is bitter. Now, what does Protagoras mean when he says something like, the wine is sweet for Socrates? Now, in order to determine that, we have to look at the metaphysical theory that Plato ascribes to Protagoras. And according to this metaphysical theory, perceptual properties and perceivings are interactions between objects and perceivers. So if we apply that to our example, then the sweetness perceived by Socrates and Socrates's perceiving of sweetness are interactions between the wine and Socrates. Now, how does this help us determine what Protagoras means when he says that the wine is sweet for Socrates? Well, remember that one claim that Protagoras makes about the wine tasting is that the wine in itself is neither sweet nor bitter. So what I suggest this means is that sweetness and bitterness are not intrinsic properties of the wine, but instead they are relations between the wine and individual perceivers, such as Socrates and Theaetetus. And this makes sense in the light of Protagoras' metaphysics, which says that these properties are interactions between the wine and perceivers, such as Socrates and Theaetetus. So in the light of this, I propose that when Protagoras says that the wine is sweet for Socrates, he should be taken to mean that the property of being sweet obtains between the wine and Socrates. And analogously, when Protagoras says that the wine is bitter for Theaetetus, he should be taken to say that the property of being bitter obtains between the wine and Theaetetus. Now, so in other words, what Protagoras says about the wine tasting is that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates, who believes that the wine is sweet, and the wine is bitter in relation to Theaetetus, who believes that the wine is bitter. And now what I suggest is that Protagoras' metaphysics is supposed to explain how both Socrates' belief and Theaetetus' belief are true. And by true here, I mean absolutely true. And both of these beliefs are absolutely true, despite the fact that they seem to conflict. So let us think about Socrates' belief first. So what I propose is that Protagoras' claim is that Socrates' belief that the wine is sweet is absolutely true. And the metaphysical explanation that Protagoras gives of this is that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. And analogously, Protagoras claims that Theaetetus's belief that the wine is bitter is absolutely true. And the metaphysical explanation that Protagoras gives of this is that the wine is bitter in relation to Theaetetus. Okay, now as an interim recap, I have explained how Protagoras, by means of his metaphysics, can account for first-order conflicts. So by first-order conflicts, I mean conflicting beliefs that are not about other beliefs, but about the world. So an example of that is the wine tasting, where we have beliefs about the taste of the wine. Now, by means of his metaphysics, Protagoras is able to explain how each of these seemingly conflicting beliefs is absolutely true. Now, there is a complication here, which is that Protagoras' metaphysics is a metaphysics of perceptual properties and perceivings. So it is not clear whether Protagoras' metaphysics can also underpin his position with respect to beliefs that are not about perceptual matters. This is debated by interpreters. So some interpreters say that Protagoras' metaphysics might be extendable to beliefs about other things, such as, say, moral properties. But that is a debate that I won't go into here. But in any case, Protagoras' theory breaks down when it comes to second-order conflicts. And by that, I mean conflicting beliefs about other beliefs, and specifically about the truth or falsehood of other beliefs. And this is shown in particular by the cleverest argument, which focuses on a very specific second-order conflict, namely the one between Protagoras' opponents and Protagoras himself, where Protagoras' opponents believe that Protagoras' view is false. And the cleverest argument shows that this second-order conflict forces Protagoras to deny his own view. Okay, now going back to Plato's two formulations of Protagoras' view, as I said, I can account for the second formulation because if Protagoras holds that all beliefs are absolutely true, then he holds that whatever is believed is true, simpliciter. But what am I going to do with the first formulation, which says that whatever is believed is true for the believer? So how am I going to explain the qualification for the believer in such a way that it does not amount to relativism about truth? Now, before I set out my own interpretation of formulation one, I'm going to discuss two existing interpretations. And what these two existing interpretations have in common with mine is that they are not relativist interpretations. So they interpret formulation one in such a way that it does not amount to relativism about truth. And I'm going to discuss this in terms of Socrates' beliefs. So remember, in the wine tasting, Socrates believes that the wine is sweet. And so, in other words, the question I'm asking is, in what sense, according to Protagoras, is what Socrates believes true for Socrates? Okay, now, the first interpretation that I want to discuss has been proposed by Gail Fine. So Gail Fine proposes that true for Socrates means believed by Socrates. So let us apply this. So given Fine's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates ends up meaning that what Socrates believes is believed by Socrates. So Fine's interpretation is not, Fine's interpretation of the first formulation is not a relativist interpretation, because given Fine's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is compatible with the statement that what Socrates believes is absolutely true, is true simpliciter. So Fine's interpretation does not exclude absolute truth. But I don't find Fine's interpretation to be very compelling. And the main reason for this is that Fine's interpretation turns the first formulation into a tautology. So given Fine's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is a tautological or vacuous statement. It means that what Socrates believes is believed by Socrates. And it seems implausible to me that the first formulation or its instances are meant to be vacuous truths. It seems to me that in ascribing the first formulation to Protagoras, Plato intends to ascribe a substantial view to Protagoras, not something that is vacuously true. So let us turn to the second existing interpretation, which has been proposed by Mitzi Lee. So according to Lee, true for Socrates is used to express how things are in relation to Socrates. So on Lee's interpretation, true for Socrates is not so much a qualification of Socrates' belief or the truth of Socrates' belief, but it's used to talk about how things are in the world. So let us apply this. Maybe it's interesting to mention here that there is such a usage of true for in English as well, but I'm not going to discuss examples of that here in the interest of time. But let us apply Lee's interpretation. So given Lee's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates, and remember that what Socrates believes is that the wine is sweet, that statement ends up meaning that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates, or as Protagoras would put this, the wine is sweet for Socrates. So like Fine's interpretation, Lee's interpretation is not a relativist interpretation, because given Lee's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is compatible with the statement that what Socrates believes is true, is absolutely true. So Lee's interpretation doesn't exclude absolute truth. However, unlike Fine's interpretation, Lee's interpretation doesn't turn the first formulation into a tautology. So given Lee's interpretation, the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is a substantial statement. It says something about what is going on in the world. It says that the wine is sweet for Socrates. But nonetheless, I don't find Lee's interpretation to be very compelling either. And the main reason for that is that it seems to me that true for Socrates is used to talk about Socrates's belief and about the truth of Socrates's belief. So on Lee's interpretation, true for Socrates only applies to Socrates's belief in a de re sense. It's only about whatever is the object of Socrates's belief. But it's really used to talk about what is the case in the world, that say the wine is sweet for Socrates. But what I propose is that the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is a statement about Socrates's belief qua Socrates's belief. So it is de dicto about Socrates's belief. So it is not just another way of saying the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. Because that would not be about Socrates's belief, but it would be about the facts, as it were, the world. And furthermore, what I propose is that the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates is a statement about how Socrates's belief is true, or how it is absolutely true. And moreover, I propose that the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates entails the statement that what Socrates believes is true, is absolutely true. So it is useful to compare my interpretation of true for Socrates with the function of to me in the statement, he is speaking to me. So in the statement, the statement that he is speaking to me entails that he is speaking. And moreover, it says something about how he is speaking. It says that his speaking is directed at me. And now analogously, what I propose is that the statement that what Socrates believes is true for Socrates entails that Socrates's belief is true. And it says something about how Socrates' belief is true. Now, what does it say about how Socrates' belief is true? Well, remember that according to my interpretation, Protagoras claims that Socrates' belief is absolutely true, and the metaphysical explanation that he gives of this is that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. So I suggest that this explains the sense in which Socrates' belief is true for Socrates. So Socrates' belief is true for Socrates in that Socrates' belief is a truth, an absolute truth that concerns Socrates. And why does it concern Socrates? Well, Socrates shows up in the metaphysical explanation of how his belief is true. His belief is true because the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. So I guess a slightly tendentious terminology for this might be to say that Socrates is part of the truth maker of his belief. And in that sense, his belief concerns Socrates and is true for Socrates. Now, here is a small passage from the Theaetetus that I think supports my view. So this passage says that my perception is true for me, for it is always of my being. Now, what we seem to get here is an explanation of the sense in which my perception is true for me in terms of my perception being of my being. Now, of course, this passage talks about perception and not about belief, but the Theaetetus doesn't always clearly distinguish at this stage between perception and belief. So I think we can also apply this to belief. And so let us apply this to Socrates' belief. So what we get then is that Socrates' belief that the wine is sweet is true for Socrates because it is of, to use the language of the passage, or it concerns, to use my own language, Socrates' being. Now, in what sense does Socrates' belief, in what sense is Socrates' belief of, or in what sense does it concern Socrates' being? Well, remember that according to my interpretation, Protagoras' explanation of the truth of Socrates' belief, the metaphysical explanation, is that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. So in other words, Socrates' belief is of or concerns how the wine is in relation to Socrates. And in that sense, it is of or concerns Socrates' being. If we look at the metaphysical explanation, then what makes the belief true is that the wine is sweet in relation to Socrates. It's true by virtue of how the wine is in relation to Socrates. Now, what is interesting is that this locution for Socrates occurs at two levels. So it occurs at the metaphysical level when Protagoras explains the truth of Socrates' belief. So when he says that the wine is sweet for Socrates, but it also occurs at the level of truth when he says that Socrates' belief is true for Socrates. And these two occurrences are closely related in that the occurrence at the level of truth is grounded in the occurrence at the level of metaphysics, in the sense that the way in which Socrates' belief is true for Socrates is to be explained in terms of it being the case that in terms of how the wine is for Socrates. So just to say that again, the way in which Socrates' belief is true for Socrates is to be explained in terms of how the wine is for Socrates. So it's to be explained in terms of the metaphysical occurrence of for Socrates. And if you remember Lee's interpretation, so according to Lee, to say that Socrates' belief is true for Socrates is simply to say that the wine is sweet for Socrates. But that is not the case on my interpretation. So on my interpretation, the claim that Socrates' belief is true for Socrates is really a claim about Socrates' belief and how Socrates' belief is true. But it is nonetheless to be explained in terms of, or part of its explanans is the metaphysical claim that the wine is sweet for Socrates. Okay, now that brings me to my conclusions. So I have argued that Protagoras in Plato's Theaetetus, which is the most detailed discussion of his views, holds that all beliefs are absolutely true. So he's not a relativist about truth. Moreover, I've shown how Protagoras, by means of his metaphysics, can account for first-order conflicts. He can explain how each of the beliefs in question is true in a case of first-order conflicting beliefs. However, Protagoras' view breaks down when it comes to second-order conflicts, conflicts about other beliefs, rather conflicting beliefs about other beliefs. And this is shown in particular by Plato by means of his cleverest argument, which focuses on the second-order conflict between Protagoras and Protagoras' opponents. Now, here are some questions for future work. So one question is, how is Protagoras portrayed in works other than Plato's Theaetetus? And is that portrayal in line with the way he is portrayed in the Theaetetus? And if I'm right about the Theaetetus, is he also portrayed as an absolutist in other works? And one work in particular to look at is Aristotle's Metaphysics, where Aristotle also discusses Protagoras. And as I said before, Aristotle claims that Protagoras violates fundamental logical principles, such as the principle of non-contradiction. So an interesting question here is, how does Aristotle understand Protagoras' view, and why does he think that Protagoras violates these logical principles, and is he right in thinking this? And a third question is, how does Protagoras' view compare to views on disagreement in contemporary philosophy? So I'm thinking here of, for instance, the debate between contextualists and relativists about truth. So in particular, John McFarlane's work might be important here. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.